For more than 40 years, California lived with a shadow it could not name. A burglar, a stalker, a rapist, a killer. He moved through quiet suburbs, entered homes at night, attacked couples, murdered victims, and vanished before police could catch him. At different times, investigators gave him different names: the Visalia Ransacker, the East Area Rapist, the original Night Stalker. But later, the world would know him by one name: the Golden State Killer. For decades, he was one of America's most terrifying unsolved predators. Authorities connected him to at least 13 murders, more than 50 sexual assaults, and well over 100 burglaries across California. Then, in 2018, investigators used a tool that changed criminal justice forever: consumer genealogy DNA. A family tree built from distant relatives led police to a former officer named James DeAngelo. In 2020, DeAngelo pleaded guilty to multiple murders and admitted many other crimes. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. This is the story of the Golden State Killer. You're watching Vanished UK. The story begins in California in the 1970s. It was a time of expanding suburbs, quiet cul-de-sacs, and families who believed their homes were safe. But in the San Joaquin Valley, near Visalia, someone was watching. Between 1974 and 1975, a burglar began breaking into homes. He stole small items: coins, jewelry, personal objects. But the burglaries were strange. He ransacked drawers, moved objects around, and seemed to enjoy invading people's private lives as much as stealing from them. He became known as the Visalia Ransacker. Then the crimes escalated. In September 1975, journalism professor Claude Snelling was shot and killed while confronting a masked intruder who had tried to abduct his daughter. For years, that killing stood as part of a violent pattern that investigators struggled to fully understand. By 1976, the attacks had shifted north to the Sacramento area, and the offender's behavior became even more terrifying. He began breaking into homes at night and attacking women. He often targeted neighborhoods in eastern Sacramento County, which led police and media to call him the East Area Rapist. His attacks were calculated. He watched homes before entering them. He learned routines. He found windows and doors. He knew when people were alone. At first, many victims were women living alone or with children. Later, he began attacking couples. He would bind the man, place dishes on his back, and threaten to kill everyone if he heard the plates move. It was psychological control as much as physical violence. Communities changed overnight. People bought locks. They installed alarms. They left lights on. Neighbors formed patrols. Police held meetings and warned residents to be careful. But the attacker kept coming. He was not just violent. He was arrogant. He made obscene and threatening phone calls. Some victims received calls before or after attacks. Police also received taunting messages from someone claiming to be the attacker. The message was clear: "You cannot catch me." For investigators, the case was maddening. They had crime scenes, witness descriptions, shoe prints, patterns. They had neighborhood maps and reports from terrified survivors. But they did not have a name. Then, around 1979, the attacks changed again. The crimes moved south. Santa Barbara County, Ventura County, Orange County, and now the offender was killing. In Southern California, he became known as the original Night Stalker. That name was used to separate him from Richard Ramirez, who later became known as the Night Stalker. But at the time, many investigators did not yet know these crimes were connected to the earlier Sacramento attacks. Couples were found murdered in their homes. Some had been bound. Some were attacked with extreme violence. The crimes were separated by geography, time, and different police jurisdictions. And in the pre-digital age, information did not move the way it does now. Cases could sit in separate filing cabinets. Clues could remain local. Patterns could be missed. Years passed, then decades. Survivors grew older. Families of the murdered waited for answers. Detectives retired. Evidence sat in storage. But the case did not die. DNA technology began to improve. Crime scene samples that had once been impossible to fully use could now be compared. In 2001, DNA evidence linked crimes from different parts of California. Investigators realized the East Area Rapist and the original Night Stalker were likely the same man. The scale of the case became clearer. This was not a local attacker. This was a predator who had moved across California for years. Writers, investigators, survivors, and amateur researchers kept public attention on the case. One of the most important voices was Michelle McNamara, whose work helped renew interest in the crimes. She used the name that would become famous, the Golden State Killer. Michelle McNamara died in 2016 before the arrest, but her book, I'll Be Gone in the Dark, helped bring the case to a new generation. And while public attention mattered, the final breakthrough came from science, genetic genealogy. Investigators had DNA from crime scenes, but it did not match anyone in traditional law enforcement databases. So investigators tried something different. They uploaded genetic information to a public genealogy database and began searching for distant relatives. Not the killer himself. His family tree. It was painstaking work. Genealogists and investigators built family lines backward through generations. They identified distant relatives. They traced branches forward. They narrowed by age, sex, location, and life history. Eventually, one name rose to the surface. Joseph James DeAngelo. DeAngelo was a former police officer. He had worked in Exeter and Auburn, California, during years that overlapped with the crime series. That detail made the case even more chilling. The man suspected of terrorizing California had once worn a badge. Investigators surveilled him. They collected discarded DNA from items connected to him. That DNA was compared to evidence from the Golden State Killer crimes. It matched. On April 24, 2018, Joseph James DeAngelo was arrested outside his home in Citrus Heights, California. He was 72 years old, a grandfather, a retired mechanic, a man who had lived quietly for decades while survivors and victims' families waited for justice. The arrest stunned the country. For many, it felt impossible that a case this old could still be solved. But the evidence had waited. Science had caught up. In June 2020, Joseph DeAngelo pleaded guilty to 13 counts of first-degree murder and admitted many other crimes. Because of statutes of limitation, many of the sexual assaults from the 1970s could not be prosecuted as rape charges. But DeAngelo admitted to numerous attacks as part of the legal proceedings. Survivors finally heard him acknowledge what he had done. In August 2020, victims and family members spoke in court. Their statements were powerful, furious, heartbreaking, and decades overdue. They described fear that never fully ended. Lives changed permanently, families broken, childhoods stolen. DeAngelo was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He will never be released. But the Golden State Killer case did not end with one conviction. It changed forensic history. After DeAngelo's arrest, genetic genealogy became one of the most important tools in cold case investigations. Cases once thought impossible began reopening. Unknown suspects could now be identified through family connections, public genealogy databases, and careful investigative work. But the method also raised difficult questions: privacy, consent, database access, how genetic information should be used. The Golden State Killer case showed the enormous power of the technology. It also forced society to ask where the boundaries should be. Still, for the victims and survivors, the breakthrough meant something simple: a name. After decades of fear, speculation, and unanswered questions, the man behind the mask had been identified. Joseph James DeAngelo was not a myth. He was not a shadow. He was a real man who committed real crimes against real people. And for decades, those people carried the cost. That is why this story must be told carefully. The technology is remarkable. The investigation is historic. But at the center of the case are survivors, murdered victims, and families who waited nearly a lifetime for justice. The Golden State Killer case is remembered because of how long he escaped, because of how many lives he destroyed, because of the terrifying scale of the crimes. But it is also remembered because of how it ended. Not with a confession in the 1970s, not with a witness chasing him down, not with a lucky traffic stop, but with DNA, a genetic trail he never knew he had left behind. For 40 years, he believed time had protected him. He was wrong. The past had not disappeared. It was waiting in evidence boxes, waiting in lab records, waiting in family trees. And in 2018, the The past finally found Joseph DeAngelo. The Golden State Killer terrorized California across the 1970s and 1980s. He remained unidentified for decades. Then, forensic genealogy changed everything. For the victims, justice came late. But it came. Some cases are solved by witnesses. Some are solved by confessions. Some are solved by one mistake. This one was solved by bloodline. This was the Golden State Killer. You're watching Vanished UK.